Probably the key one for the state anyhow, is to let them know that when we looked around the nation and internationally at other places that are dealing with this issue and looked at how they're dealing with it and what their timelines for defining, designing, and implementing plans, that typically it's a multi-decade process to get something in place. So there is no time like the present to get started. Here's something that I'm sure everyone has seen sooner or later. This is the Sewell's Point tide gauge, the NOAA record, and it very clearly shows that we are experiencing an increase in sea level rise. And of course, if you look at the end of that record, you can note that the rate of rise appears to have been accelerating. And in fact, there is considerable work now that is documenting that that acceleration appears to be real. The things that are causing the change are, of course, more water in the ocean, so melting polar ice caps. And again, what we find we have to explain to a lot of people is that the ice that is adding water to the oceans is the ice that is on land. Okay, so yes, if you have an ice cube in your glass and it melts, the water level doesn't go up, but if you have the ice cube sitting outside of the glass and it melts and flows in, the water level will go up, and that's what's happening with our polar ice caps and glaciers. The other thing that's going on is that the ocean water itself is warming, and as water warms, it expands. And so that too contributes to an increase in volume in the oceans. And then here locally, we have this thing called isostatic glacial rebound going on, which 20,000 years ago, when we were in the last ice age, and the glaciers were covering much of the northern part of the U.S. and northeastern part of the U.S., they effectively weighed so much that they were pushing down on the tectonic plate that we sit on, the crust of the Earth, and it caused our part of that plate to bulge upward. And when they retreated and melted away, the Earth has been slowly but surely equilibrating ever since. So we are, to this day, still sinking slowly in this area as a result of the relief of that pressure. And then on top of that, we are also sinking more locally as a result of some groundwater withdrawals. And if you look at this map, this was work that was done back in the 80s and 90s with re-leveling of benchmarks throughout the mid-Atlantic. Actually, it went much further south than this. But there were a couple of epicenters of very rapid subsidence, relatively rapid subsidence. And if you're familiar with the local geography, you'll know that this was the paper mill down in Suffolk, and this is the paper mill up in West Point, both of which were withdrawing millions of gallons a day from about 900 to 1,000 feet down as part of the process waters. And just like in Texas and in the Southwest, where you withdraw lots of oil or water, the overlying land slowly but surely subsides. So that's going on top of the glacial isostatic rebound subsidence that's going on, and that combined with rising water levels is what's causing much of the seawater, the relative rise in sea level. The other thing that we have learned more recently is going on in this area. It has to do with ocean circulation. And you're all, I think, familiar with the Gulf Stream, which flows north past our coast here. It is part of a much larger circulation in the Atlantic Ocean, which takes warm tropical water to the north where it's cooled, sinks, and then flows back south in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. Well, when water is moving, it tends to, there are a number of forces that come into play, and the result here in the northern hemisphere is that when water moves, there is a net transport to the right of the water that piles water up off of our coast. So as the Gulf Stream flows north, the speed at which it moves is affecting the amount of water that is actually piled up in the middle of the ocean or off of our coast. And the difference between what we see here along the coast and what we see on the other side of the Gulf Stream can be as much as a meter. Well, as the Gulf Stream slows, which is what's happening currently, that difference begins to relax. And so that actually adds to the rate of rise that we see here locally. What we don't know, and this is the source of much discussion and debate in the science community right now, is whether or not this speed up and slow down of the Gulf Stream is a natural cycle which will recur, or whether the deceleration that we are currently seeing is something that will continue on into the future. And so that is a fair amount of the uncertainty we have in what the future of sea level rise in this area will be. Global sea level rise is somewhere on the order of 2 to 4 millimeters a year. It's actually going up as the polar ice caps melt even more rapidly. Land in this area is sinking somewhere 1 to 3 millimeters. There are some areas where it's actually more rapid than that. But those two factors combined, along with whatever is happening as a result of this change in ocean circulation, produce what we experience here locally. And so historically looking back 1,000 years or so, the rate of change here has been about a foot per century. We are now more in the 2 foot per century range with the potential that we will actually see an acceleration. If you look at this, you can see that basically we're looking, we think, at a probability, a highest probability of a rise in sea level somewhere between 3 and 5 feet by the end of the century. Now, it's the end of the century point that I want to sort of emphasize here, because one of the things that we find ourselves trying to explain, particularly to our political leaders, is that this is an issue which requires meaningful attention today, but it's not a disaster that requires we figure out what the response has to be by tomorrow. This is something we are going to be dealing with for a considerable period of time. And in fact, the best planning is going to require that we keep monitoring to figure out which of these lines we're experiencing. So if we're on this line, we're going to need one set of responses, but if we're on this line, there is a different sort of planning scenario that would be appropriate. And so looking at, I'm using Hampton here, this is some of the work that we're currently trying to pull together, and what this is showing is based on elevations in Hampton. So this is very fine, it's called LiDAR data, very highly resolved elevation data. And what we've done is begun to map, based on risk zones, how rapidly one might have to plan to accommodate changes. So we're looking, in this case, what we're looking at is from current water levels plus 7 feet. So 7 feet is about the storm surge that we get with our 1 in 100-year storm. It's about what Hurricane Isabel brought to a lot of areas. So if you figure that if you're anywhere from 0 to 7 feet on the land surface and you're at risk from a 1% flooding risk currently, then that should inform the kinds of actions that you take on your property. If you're a homeowner, you know, it should inform whether or not you're going to be selling your property, whether you're going to be planning to sort of survive through this storms that accommodate the flooding. If you're a retail merchant, this would inform your decisions about investments in your property going forward. So what this looks at in that color scheme, going from red to blue, is based on elevations in Hampton and looking at this risk zone of 0 to 7 feet. If you took that highest curve for sea level rise, this is if that's the one we end up experiencing, this is telling you that if you're in that darkest red zone, you're already in a point where you're going to have to plan to leave. Basically, you're going to be underwater sometime in the next 10 years. But if you're in these lighter blue zones, you probably have 60, 70, or more years before you're truly at risk of being underwater continually. And so that's the kind of planning horizon that you've got. So depending on where you sit on this landscape, your need to plan to move or to plan to accommodate getting wet frequently is different. And that depends entirely on which of the scenarios you look at. So this was the worst case scenario, remember? This is the one that we seem to be on currently. This was that yellow line. And so you can see that it changes significantly the areas that would be at risk sometime in the next 100 years. And then if we're on the lowest scenario, it further changes the areas that are at risk. So it's not a doomsday scenario, unless, of course, you happen to be in one of those red zones. But it is something that should begin to let us plan for the rate and the necessity of making accommodation plans.
I was wondering if you were proposing any legislation to deal with, you said you have to contemplate selling, et cetera, but if your property is worth $500,000 and no one's going to buy it if they know it's going to be underwater in the next 20 years, And so I don't see anything out there that the legislators are doing to compensate those people who may lose their property based on water levels, especially if the property was bought originally as not being in a flood zone and now has been redeclared in a flood zone. So it seems like to me, FEMA insurance companies aren't wanting to insure the property. Talking about down in North Carolina, what he read this morning about saying, well, it brings in $10 million in tourist funds to the state and to Hatteras. But in this case, I don't ever see any discussion of how you're going to compensate those people who went there in good faith before this happened. And I'm wondering, we need to do it now rather than later, how you're going to compensate those people in the red zones and the next zone, et cetera. Sorry.
I'll only make 2 points for you. One is, it is a point of active discussion right now. There is ongoing work on all the legal issues that surround this. The second is, I happen to be one of those people who bought a house and I have all of my equity in an area that is going to be, it's in one of those red zones. I honestly do not expect the public to pay me for my investment. That's a risk that I took on personally. I would love you to do it, but there are a lot of me and you can't afford to do it. And so it is going to be a real significant social and economic impact in our region. We need to begin planning for it, but to think that there is a solution, an easy solution, is probably not correct.
The message that I have for you this morning is that Norfolk's task is to learn to live with the water, and that's what we're doing. In that picture you see concrete infrastructure in the form of the bridge, and you also see, most of you I think would recognize wetland restoration in progress. This is at the point where we've hauled out the old telephone books, the old refrigerators, the shopping carts, hunks of concrete, tires, et cetera, and done some work to cut back on the invasive species on Phragmites and replant with Spartina and put up, anybody know what those little strings are? Goose fence, right, exactly. So what this does, this wetlands restoration, is a couple of things for us. It increases water quality as the water filters through that wetland restoration. It increases the capacity of the land to act as a sponge and hold back floodwaters. It increases the aesthetic value. You really can't put a price on greenery and what it does for the human soul. So we're at a point where we're looking both at the blue-green infrastructure as well as the hardscape and how do they work together to make sure that we can live here together happily for at least another 500 years. We were looking at data from the greater Richmond area, which really does have a lot of green space. And when I really looked at those maps and realized what the proportion of green space was in the greater Richmond area to impervious surface, and then looked at Norfolk, the realization dawned that for us, every single tree counts. If we lose one tree, we can quantify the impact on the environment. So we're really emphasizing increasing our tree canopy from 33 up to 40%. We plant 800 to 1,000 trees every year, but if there's a storm, we lose more than that. We don't lose many trees to development, but to disease and storms. This is a part of the hardscape. We're investing millions of dollars in not only drainage systems, but also in upgrading our wastewater collection systems. And you might wonder, why are we talking about wastewater with regard to flooding? And the message is that our infrastructure tends to be older, and some of the sewers back up. And when the sewers back up, that spills out over onto the sidewalk. And when that happens, it can end up in the water. So it's not a flooding issue, but it's more water quality. And what we found is they really are going hand in hand. What we've seen in Norfolk is that areas that flooded regularly are continuing to flood. Areas that formerly did not flood during the regular lunar high tides are starting to flood. And so one of the strategies, and it's an informal strategy for living with the water, is that neighbors tell their neighbors when they're new, because we have a high percentage of renters, to move their cars when it looks like it's going to flood. Several years ago, the city contracted with a Dutch company called Foodwell, and we've also worked with Timmons and Moffett and Nichols here in town, and we've been looking jointly at how do we adapt to rising seawaters as well as increased precipitation. And we've come up with several structural proposals, including a series of pumps like the pump that we have downtown. And have you all seen the seawall around Nauticus? And the pump, does that ring a bell with everybody? The plan is that we will need more of those. We'll need more trees and more wetlands, more oyster restorations, rain gardens, probably rooftop gardens, and we'll also probably need to retreat strategically from places that are subject to repetitive flooding and really just are not good places for people to build. Right now we don't know where those sites are. You know, we have good maps of where the repetitive flooding areas are and have worked with FEMA and residents to protect that property because A, it's valuable, as you pointed out, and B, people like to live on the coast. We feel good when we're near the coast, and that's important for people. So it's important for us both to protect our land and to understand if we have to let some of it go back to nature, where are the high value pieces that should go back, and as you said, so then how do we structure payments for that? Does it constitute a taking? From the point of view of the Constitution, if we in effect take away your ability to build on your land based on our regulations. So it's a really, really important time in Norfolk's history. Climate is changing fast. The state of knowledge in the scientific community is unbelievable in terms of climate change and sea level rise and what the driving factors are. The part that is in the process of moving forward and adapting to the changes in the natural world are our institutions. So land use policy and land use law, flooding requirement or flood insurance requirements, those are all changing.
Are there any investments going on right now in the flooding issue other than the
Other than the studies,
yeah.
we regularly are improving our stormwater drainage. So we've got projects throughout the city, and they're on the webpage. And they're spent in Ocean View, pumping projects as well as some road elevation projects and individual home elevation projects. And we've changed drastically, I think, the zoning, or in the process of changing our zoning ordinance so that you've got to increase the freeboard for homes if you build in the more vulnerable